Imagine opening a can of Pepsi and realizing the company that made it owned submarines, a cruiser, a destroyer, and enough warships to rank among the world's largest navies. It sounds like satire. It wasn't. In 1989, one business deal briefly turned a soda company into a military power. To understand how a soft drink company ended up owning warships, you first have to step inside the Soviet Union during the Cold War. American companies rarely did business behind the Iron Curtain, and Soviet citizens had little access to Western brands. Nearly every industry was controlled by the state, and imported consumer goods were uncommon. Yet curiosity about life in the West remained strong, and one American product stood out above the rest: Pepsi. For PepsiCo, the Soviet Union represented an enormous untapped market. There was just one problem. The Soviet ruble couldn't be freely exchanged for US dollars, making a normal business deal nearly impossible. If Pepsi wanted to sell millions of bottles inside the USSR, it would need an entirely different way to get paid. That challenge would spark one of the strangest business deals in history. The story truly began in 1959, during the American National Exhibition in Moscow. The event showcased American technology, appliances, and consumer products to Soviet visitors. Among the exhibits was an ice-cold Pepsi stand. In a moment that became famous around the world, U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon encouraged Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to try a cup of Pepsi. Cameras captured the Soviet leader smiling as he tasted one of America's most recognizable drinks. The photo became priceless publicity. Pepsi executives realized they had introduced their brand to millions behind the Iron Curtain. Years later, after lengthy negotiations, Pepsi reached a groundbreaking agreement with the Soviet government, becoming the first major American consumer product manufactured and sold inside the USSR. It wasn't just a soda deal. It was a rare bridge between two rivals locked in the Cold War. Selling Pepsi inside the Soviet Union was one thing. Getting paid was another. Because the Soviet ruble couldn't be traded internationally, Pepsi couldn't simply convert its earnings into US dollars. Instead, the two sides created an unusual barter agreement. In exchange for Pepsi syrup and bottling rights, the Soviet Union granted PepsiCo the exclusive rights to import and distribute Stolichnaya Vodka in the United States. For years, the arrangement worked surprisingly well. Americans bought more Stolichnaya, the Soviet government earned valuable hard currency, and Pepsi expanded across the USSR. It was one of the largest East-West business partnerships of the Cold War. But by the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was faltering. Vodka sales were no longer enough to support the growing Pepsi deal, and an even stranger solution was about to emerge. By 1989, the Soviet Union was in deep economic trouble. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had opened the country, but they couldn't stop a financial crisis that was growing worse by the month. Consumer demand for Pepsi continued to rise, yet the Soviet government lacked the hard currency needed to expand its agreement with PepsiCo. The old vodka arrangement could no longer cover the deal. Rather than walk away, negotiators searched for something else the Soviet Union had in abundance. The answer seemed almost unbelievable. As the Soviet Navy began retiring older vessels, officials proposed using decommissioned military ships as part of the payment. It sounded absurd, but from a legal and business standpoint, the offer solved a problem neither side had been able to fix with money alone. The final agreement stunned the world. Instead of cash, the Soviet Union transferred ownership of a fleet of decommissioned naval vessels to PepsiCo as partial payment. The deal included 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer, along with several support ships. For a brief moment, Pepsi legally owned more military vessels than many of the world's smaller navies. The company had no intention of operating a fleet. These aging Cold War ships were no longer fit for military service and were destined to be dismantled. Pepsi immediately arranged for them to be sold to a Swedish scrap company, where the steel would be recycled. Even so, the paperwork told an unbelievable story. A soft drink company had, however briefly, become the owner of Soviet warships. News of the deal spread around the globe, and the headlines sounded almost too ridiculous to believe. Newspapers joked that Pepsi had become a military superpower overnight. Technically, the company temporarily held title to more naval vessels than many nations, even though every ship was headed for the scrapyard. The image of a soda company owning submarines was irresistible. Pepsi executive Donald Kendall embraced the humor with a remark that became legendary. Speaking to U.S. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, he joked, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." The line captured the bizarre reality of the moment. What began as a creative solution to a payment problem had turned into one of the most unforgettable corporate stories of the Cold War. The timing made the story even more remarkable. Just 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, bringing the Cold War to an end. The unusual barter system that had allowed Pepsi to thrive behind the Iron Curtain disappeared along with it. As Russia embraced a market economy, Western companies could finally conduct business using conventional currency instead of trading products or retired military hardware. The Pepsi Navy became a fascinating footnote in history, but it also revealed something much larger. Even at the height of global rivalry, business found ways to cross political divides when governments could not. A company that set out to sell soft drinks had inadvertently become part of one of the Cold War's strangest economic experiments, proving that history often unfolds in ways no one could have predicted. Today, the idea of Pepsi owning a fleet of Soviet warships sounds like an urban legend. Yet every major part of the story is true. The company never sailed submarines, hired sailors, or became a military power. The ships were obsolete, ownership was temporary, and they were quickly sold for scrap. Even so, for one extraordinary moment in 1989, a soda company legally possessed a fleet that captured headlines around the world. The Cola Navy remains one of the strangest business deals ever completed, reminding us that history isn't always shaped by battles or presidents. Sometimes it's shaped by economics, creativity, and a problem that couldn't be solved with money alone. And sometimes the most unbelievable stories turn out to be the ones that actually happened. Until next time, keep turning the pages of the dusty ledger.